Sarah's heart pounded violently in her chest as she was pulled through the dense underbrush, each branch and thorn scraping at her skin. The creature's grip was like iron, unrelenting and strong, pulling her with a force that made it impossible to break free. Her mind raced, struggling to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before her. The gorilla, massive and powerful, seemed to move through the forest with ease, its large, muscular frame cutting a path through the trees with terrifying speed. Fear twisted inside her as the sounds of the forest faded into the background, drowned out by the deafening rush of blood in her ears. Her mind screamed at her to do something, anything, but all she could do was try to twist out of its grip, futilely kicking her legs and clawing at the gorilla's thick arm. The creature's fur was coarse and rough under her fingertips, its strength nearly suffocating her as it continued its relentless march forward. She tried to scream again, but the gorilla's hand was still pressed over her mouth, muffling any sound that could escape. The air was thick with the scent of earth and wet leaves, and she could hear the soft rustling of animals in the trees, but none dared to approach the massive beast dragging her through the woods. Every second felt like an eternity, and Sarah's chest tightened with a growing sense of dread. What did it want with her? Through her blurred vision, she caught sight of the forest around her, a blur of green, shadows, and movement. The trees grew denser, the light dimmer, and the air colder. Sarah's stomach churned as she realized they were moving deeper into the heart of the forest, far from the path she had tried to follow. The fear of being lost had now become a nightmare far worse than anything she could have imagined. Her mind raced for any possible escape, but nothing seemed possible. The gorilla was too strong, its grip too tight. She had no way of defending herself, no weapon, no plan. She was completely at the mercy of this wild creature, with no idea what its intentions were. As they moved further into the forest, the landscape began to change. The trees grew older and thicker, their trunks twisted and gnarled, and the air became damp and cool. The sound of running water filled her ears, and Sarah realized they were approaching some sort of ravine or stream. Her heart skipped a beat as the gorilla came to a sudden stop, standing at the edge of a steep drop. For a moment, Sarah thought she might be thrown over the edge, her body sent tumbling into the unknown. But instead, the gorilla turned abruptly and dragged her to the side, heading for a cluster of thick vines and moss-covered rocks. Sarah's breath hitched as she saw it. A cave entrance, dark and ominous, hidden deep in the forest, away from prying eyes. The gorilla's movements were swift, almost deliberate, as if it had done this before. The cave loomed ahead like a gaping mouth, a place of darkness and mystery. Sarah's mind raced, her panic rising to a new level. Was this where it was taking her? A feeling of utter helplessness washed over her as the gorilla tugged her inside. The air inside the cave was thick with the smell of damp earth and stone, and the echoes of their footsteps seemed to reverberate unnervingly off the walls. The cave was deep, the darkness swallowing them whole. As Sarah was dragged further in, the last glimmer of daylight disappeared, leaving only the dim glow of the entrance behind them. The gorilla finally released its grip on her, but she was too terrified to move. She stood frozen, her body aching from the rough treatment, her mind a blur of confusion and fear. The gorilla backed away slowly, watching her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Its eyes gleamed in the dim light, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw something almost human in its gaze, a kind of understanding, maybe even curiosity. But that thought was quickly overshadowed by the bone-chilling reality of her situation. She was trapped, alone, in a dark, strange cave with a creature she could barely comprehend. The gorilla did not approach her again, but it did not leave either. It simply watched her, its massive form looming in the shadows, as if waiting for something. Sarah's mind raced, her heart pounding against her ribs. She didn't know what it wanted or what it planned to do with her, but one thing was clear. She was no longer in control of her own fate. The world outside the cave, the path she had been on, seemed so distant now, like a forgotten dream. The silence between them grew heavy, broken only by the soft dripping of water somewhere in the distance, as Sarah realized that this was her new reality. She had been kidnapped by a wild gorilla, and whatever happened next was beyond her control. The cave felt like a different world entirely, an oppressive, silent world where the air was thick with moisture and the light barely pierced the shadows. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her heart still racing from the fear of being dragged through the forest by the gorilla. Now that they had reached the dark, cavernous space, a strange stillness settled in around her. The gorilla had released her, but it didn't leave. It simply retreated into the shadows, its massive form barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the entrance. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes darting around the cave, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The walls were rough, jagged stone, and the floor was uneven, littered with fallen rocks and debris. In the back of the cave, there was a faint glimmer of something, soft, shimmering light that came from an odd, almost unnatural source. But it wasn't the light that held her attention. It was the strange feeling of being observed, the eyes of the gorilla still locked on her. The deeper she looked into the cave, the more unsettling it became. It was as though this place had been lived in for years, maybe even decades. There were remnants of other creatures, bones scattered around, some half-eaten, others weathered with age. But it wasn't just animals that had been brought here. Odd, human-made objects were also strewn about. Broken tools, ripped pieces of clothing, and the occasional discarded item like a watch or a set of keys. It was as if the gorilla had been collecting things, as if it had been living in isolation for far too long and had started to gather anything it could find. As Sarah's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized that the cave was much larger than it had first appeared. In the farthest corner, there was a small alcove, and it looked like a nest, soft bedding made of shredded leaves, moss, and animal pelts. It was crude but comforting, as though the gorilla had made a place for itself to sleep, a place it could call its own. Sarah shuddered, her mind still spinning from the reality of her situation. This is where I'm going to be kept, she thought. This is where I'm trapped. The gorilla, still looming in the shadows, seemed to observe her with a strange calmness, its massive chest rising and falling slowly as if it were waiting for something. Sarah, shaking with a mixture of fear and confusion, took a tentative step forward, her legs stiff from the tension. She glanced back at the entrance to the cave, but the thick underbrush outside felt like an unreachable world. She had no way of knowing how far they had come or how far the gorilla had dragged her. The outside world, the sunlight, felt like a distant memory. Without warning, the gorilla shifted, moving closer to Sarah with an almost cautious grace. Her heart leapt into her throat, but it did not attack. Instead, it reached out with one large, furry hand and grabbed a small bundle of food from a nearby corner. A bundle of fruit and what appeared to be raw meat. The gorilla held the food out to her, its eyes glimmering as it offered it in silence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't attacking her, but it wasn't exactly being kind either. The gorilla seemed to be waiting for her to accept the offering. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She couldn't understand what was happening, couldn't fathom what this creature wanted from her. But hunger gnawed at her stomach, and instinctively, she took the food from the gorilla's outstretched hand. The fruit was surprisingly sweet, though the meat had a strange, metallic taste. She forced herself to eat, her mind still racing with fear. Was this its way of trying to comfort her? Was it testing her, trying to see if she would comply with its commands? She couldn't be sure, but she knew one thing: she had to survive. As she ate, her eyes continued to scan the cave, trying to find something that might explain the gorilla's odd behavior. The more she looked, the more she realized that this wasn't just any cave. There were signs that the gorilla had been here for a long time. Scratches in the stone, deep gouges where the creature had probably been sharpening its claws or marking its territory. But there was something else. Along the walls, strange symbols had been carved into the rock. Runes that seemed both ancient and unfamiliar, their meanings lost to time. The gorilla took a step back, giving Sarah space to breathe, but its eyes never left her. She wondered if it saw her as a threat, or if it was trying to protect her in its own twisted way. As the darkness of the cave closed in around her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was part of something much larger than herself, a story far older than her own, one that would unfold slowly, painfully, and in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. This was her new reality. This was her hideout. And as the days wore on, Sarah would come to realize that the true mystery wasn't the gorilla itself, but the strange connection that began to form between them in the heart of this desolate cave. Days had passed since Sarah had been dragged into the depths of the forest, trapped in the cave that now felt like a twisted prison. She had tried everything she could think of to escape, testing the strength of the rocks, attempting to slip past the gorilla during the rare moments when it wandered away. But nothing worked. Every time she moved or made a noise, the creature's eyes would fixate on her, and it would return, always watching, always waiting. Sarah's body ached from the rough treatment, her mind numb with the fear of being stuck in the same place, day after day. She had stopped trying to fight the gorilla. The idea of escape seemed as impossible as the idea of understanding what had brought her here in the first place. One evening, as the air in the cave grew colder and the light from the entrance dimmed, Sarah sat on the soft bed of moss in the corner, staring into the darkness. She had stopped crying days ago. Instead, she tried to rationalize her situation, attempting to find some explanation for what was happening. Why had the gorilla taken her? What did it want with her? It didn't behave like an animal driven only by hunger or aggression. It seemed more intelligent than that, more thoughtful. But why? Her gaze shifted to the strange carvings on the walls. She had spent hours tracing them, trying to decode their meaning, but they remained an enigma. They weren't just random scratches. They were symbols, arranged in patterns. It was clear to her now that they weren't the work of a mere animal, but rather someone or something that had knowledge of language, of communication. The symbols were too deliberate, too precise. That night, as the gorilla approached her once again, offering her food, something strange happened. The creature seemed agitated, pacing around the cave, its movements sharp and erratic. It let out a low, guttural growl, not directed at her, but at something deeper in the cave. Sarah froze. Her heart raced as she realized the gorilla was not angry with her. It was scared. The creature's movements were hurried now, almost frantic. It stopped in front of the carvings, running its fingers across the walls, its breath heavy and quick. It was as if it was trying to communicate something urgent, but Sarah couldn't understand. Then, with a suddenness that left her breathless, the gorilla turned toward her, its eyes wide, almost pleading. It reached out and grabbed her arm, gently pulling her toward the back of the cave. The further they went, the darker it became. The cave was so deep now that the natural light from the entrance was almost non-existent. But then, as they passed a particularly sharp bend in the stone, Sarah saw it, a faint glow emanating from behind a thick wall of vines. The gorilla moved toward it, his massive hands working quickly to clear the vines away, revealing a hidden chamber. As the vines fell away, Sarah gasped. Inside the chamber was a large, flat stone, covered in more intricate carvings, this time more detailed, more refined. There were symbols, just like the ones on the walls of the cave, but these seemed different, more complex. But what truly caught Sarah's attention was the shape of the stone. It wasn't just a flat rock. It was a massive slab, almost like an altar, and on top of it lay a set of objects, pieces of a broken, ancient sculpture, its face cracked but still hauntingly familiar. The face was unmistakable, a human face but distorted, as if twisted in pain or fear. Sarah's blood ran cold as the realization hit her like a thunderclap. The face belonged to a woman, one that looked eerily similar to her. She took a shaky step closer to the stone, her hand trembling as it reached out to touch the broken pieces of the sculpture. The gorilla stepped back, watching her with an intensity that made her feel like she was standing on the edge of some terrible precipice. Her fingers brushed the fragments, and as they made contact, a strange energy surged through her body. The carvings on the walls seemed to come alive, glowing with a soft, eerie light. The symbols began to shift, as though they were rearranging themselves, forming new patterns, new meanings that she could almost understand. In that moment, she felt a deep, ancient connection to this place, as if something inside her was awakening. The gorilla's voice, low and rumbling, broke through the silence. It wasn't speaking words, but something in its tone felt urgent, desperate. Suddenly, memories flashed through Sarah's mind, visions of another time, another life. She saw herself not as the woman she was now, but as someone else, someone who had lived in this very forest centuries ago. She saw herself as part of a tribe, her face youthful and alive, but now she understood that she had been part of something much darker, much older. She had been a guardian of these forests, a protector of ancient secrets, secrets that the gorilla had been guarding for millennia. The revelation hit her like a wave crashing over her body. She had not been kidnapped by the gorilla. She had been chosen. The gorilla wasn't just an animal. It was the last of an ancient race, one that had been entrusted with the task of protecting this sacred place, this hidden chamber, the stone, the carvings, the face on the altar. They were all part of a ritual that had been passed down through generations. A ritual to preserve the knowledge and power of the forest, to protect the very essence of life that had lived here long before humanity had even existed. And Sarah was the key. She wasn't just some random hiker. She was a descendant of the Guardians, a link between the ancient world and the present. She had been brought back to this place because it was her destiny to fulfill a long-forgotten promise. The gorilla had recognized her. It had known who she was before she had even stepped into the cave. The symbols on the walls, now glowing brightly, told the story of an ancient civilization that had once ruled this land, a civilization that had harnessed the power of the forest and its creatures. But that power had been lost, forgotten over time, and now the gorilla had been waiting for someone to return, someone who could restore balance to this sacred place. And that person was Sarah. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the weight of the revelation. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was part of something much larger than herself, something that connected her to the earth, to the forest, to the creatures that had roamed here for centuries. But the question remained, what would she do with this newfound knowledge? What was the next step in a journey that was far beyond her understanding? As the glowing symbols on the walls pulsed with an ancient rhythm, Sarah realized that this was only the beginning. The gorilla had shown her the way, and now it was up to her to uncover the secrets that lay hidden in the heart of the forest, secrets that could change the world forever. Sarah's heart pounded as the weight of the revelation settled deep within her bones. She had spent days trapped in this cave, unsure of her fate, but now she understood her place in the grand, ancient tapestry that the gorilla had been guarding for centuries. She wasn't a victim or a captive. She was a part of something far greater, something rooted in the very soul of the forest that had been untouched by time. But the more she thought about the strange connection between her and the gorilla, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to shift, slipping through her fingers like sand. As the glowing symbols on the walls pulsed around her, Sarah stepped back from the altar, the weight of the ancient truth pressing down on her chest. The gorilla watched her with an intensity that felt like it could pierce through her very being. It had been waiting for her, waiting for the one who would awaken the ancient connection. But as she stood there, staring at the strange sculpture of her face, something began to feel off. The symbols that had once seemed to promise an answer were now growing more frantic in their glow, more erratic. She felt a prickling at the back of her neck, an ominous sensation that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The gorilla, its massive chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths, took a few steps closer, its eyes widening in what appeared to be panic. It let out a sharp growl, one that sounded almost desperate. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece everything together, but something about the way the gorilla was acting didn't make sense. She had been chosen, that much was clear. She had been brought here to restore the balance. But why was the creature now behaving as though it was afraid? Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A low rumble reverberated through the cave, and the walls seemed to shift, groaning as though they were alive. The symbols on the stone slab flickered and then vanished, replaced by new markings, twisted, jagged lines that made Sarah's skin crawl. The glow that had once seemed like a warm invitation now turned cold and harsh, casting eerie shadows across the room. The gorilla, sensing the shift, stepped back, its eyes wide with alarm. In the distance, a distant, unearthly howl echoed through the cave. It wasn't the sound of wind, nor the cry of an animal. It was a sound that seemed to come from deep beneath the earth, from something older than time itself. The gorilla recoiled, pressing itself against the wall of the cave, its back arched as though trying to protect itself from something. Sarah's breath hitched. The air in the cave seemed to thicken, pressing down on her, suffocating her with a strange sense of dread. It was then that she realized the symbols, the altar, the carvings, they weren't just part of some ritual to protect the forest. They were part of a far darker, more ancient power, a power that had been dormant for centuries. And now, it was awakening. The gorilla's movements became erratic, as though it were torn between two forces. It let out another growl, but this time it wasn't directed at her. It was directed at the shadows that seemed to be closing in around them. The very air in the cave seemed to ripple with an unnatural force, as though some malevolent presence was stirring beneath the surface. And then, Sarah saw it. Emerging from the darkness, from the depths of the cave, a figure stepped forward. Tall, dark, and impossibly ancient. It was humanoid in shape, but its skin was covered in a layer of moss and decay, as if it had been buried in the earth for millennia. Its eyes, glowing a fiery red, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that sent ice through her veins. This was no simple creature. It was the true guardian of the cave, the true force that had been watching over the forest and its secrets. The gorilla had not been the true protector after all. It had been a sentinel, a servant to the real force that had slumbered here, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The figure raised its hand, and Sarah felt a sharp pain in her chest, a searing, burning sensation that took her breath away. She stumbled back, gasping for air, but it wasn't the figure that was causing the pain. It was something deeper, something within her. It was as if the ancient power was pulling at her very soul, as if she were being torn in two. The gorilla, its eyes filled with panic, stepped forward as though to protect her, but it was too late. The figure raised its other hand, and with a wave of its arm, a blast of energy erupted from the depths of the cave, knocking the gorilla back. The creature let out a terrible roar, but the force of the blast sent it sprawling to the ground, its massive body crumpling against the stone walls. It was clear, the gorilla was no match for the power that was now unleashed. Sarah tried to stand, but the pain in her chest was unbearable. She collapsed to her knees, gasping, unable to breathe, unable to think. The figure's eyes never left her, and the power it commanded seemed to coil around her like a noose, tightening with each passing moment. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the figure spoke. "You have come to awaken the truth," it said, its voice a low, rumbling growl that echoed through the cave. "But you were never meant to be the savior. You were never meant to return. The power you seek is not yours to claim. It is mine, and now you will serve it." Sarah's mind reeled. She had thought she was chosen, that she was the one meant to restore balance to this place. But now, as the pain in her chest intensified and the figure's voice filled her head, she realized the truth. The gorilla had not been protecting her. It had been protecting the forest from something far worse, something that had been sealed away long ago. And now that the seal had been broken, there was no going back. The twist, the terrible revelation that shattered everything she had believed, was that Sarah wasn't the key to saving the forest. She was the catalyst that would awaken the darkness buried beneath it. The ancient power had been waiting for her to return, and now that she had, there would be no turning back. The forest was no longer safe. The gorilla had been right to fear this moment, and now Sarah had to face the consequences of her actions. The creature's red eyes locked onto hers as it stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Sarah realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that the forest's true guardian wasn't a protector at all. It was a predator, and she had just awakened it. The dark figure loomed over Sarah, its fiery red eyes glowing with an ominous intensity that filled the cave with a suffocating presence. Her chest burned with the searing pain from the energy that pulsed through her body, and her breaths came in ragged gasps. The ancient figure's voice echoed in her mind, a low, rumbling growl that reverberated like a warning bell, telling her that her fate had already been sealed. "You have awakened the power," the figure intoned, its voice heavy with malice. "Now you will serve it, or perish." As the words sank into her consciousness, the terror that had consumed Sarah since her first encounter with the gorilla reached new heights. She had thought she was the one chosen to restore balance, But now she understood the horrifying truth. She wasn't a savior. She was a pawn in a much darker game, the catalyst for the awakening of an ancient evil that had been sealed away for centuries. Her legs trembled beneath her, and she struggled to remain conscious as the strange energy continued to course through her, draining her strength. But even as the figure's power wrapped around her, she felt a flicker of defiance ignite deep inside her. She had fought for survival her whole life, and this wasn't how her story was going to end. Sarah's eyes flicked toward the gorilla, which lay motionless against the cave wall, its massive form twisted and broken from the blast of energy. The creature's eyes were closed, its breathing shallow. It had been defeated, but there was still a part of her that couldn't abandon the bond they had formed, the connection she had only just begun to understand. She couldn't let this ancient evil win. She couldn't let it claim her. The figure took a step closer, and as it did, a wave of panic swept over Sarah. This was it. This was the end. But just as the figure raised its hand again, preparing to deliver the final blow, Sarah's survival instincts kicked in. Her heart raced, her vision blurred with pain, but her mind focused with a singular purpose: escape. Her hand shot out, fingers brushing the sharp stone edge of the altar, and she felt it, an almost imperceptible shift in the energy around her. The symbols that had once glowed with a dark, malevolent power were now pulsing erratically, as though they were responding to her touch. A surge of understanding flooded her mind. The energy that bound her wasn't just one-sided. She could fight back. She could break free. The figure's eyes widened in alarm, sensing the shift, but it was too late. Sarah's hands gripped the edges of the stone slab, and with a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pushed herself to her feet. The pain in her chest intensified, but she fought through it, focusing on the power she had just discovered within herself. As she stood, she realized something. The figure wasn't as all-powerful as it seemed. It relied on the cave, on the dark energy that flowed through the walls, through the symbols. The cave was its source of power, but that power was also its prison. If she could break its connection to the cave, she could break the figure's hold on her. The realization struck her like lightning. In a single, desperate motion, Sarah lunged forward, her body almost propelled by the surge of energy that now thrummed through her veins. She reached for the carvings on the walls, her fingers skimming the jagged symbols as the figure's wrath rumbled behind her. It howled in fury, but Sarah didn't stop. She could feel the cave's power resisting her, but her determination was stronger. With one last mighty effort, she pressed her hand against the largest symbol on the stone wall. As soon as her fingers made contact, a shock wave of pure energy exploded from the carving, ripping through the cave. The symbols glowed brighter than they ever had before, their patterns shifting and changing in ways that Sarah couldn't fully comprehend. The figure screamed, its voice twisted with rage and fear, but it couldn't stop what was happening. The cave itself seemed to tremble, as if the very earth was trying to reject the figure's presence. The ground shook violently, and the air grew thick, pressing down on Sarah's chest as she held her ground. The power she had awakened within herself spread like wildfire through the cave, unraveling the dark energy that had once bound the figure to this place. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the energy exploded outward in a burst of light that blinded Sarah. The cavern trembled, and with a deafening crack, the stone walls began to crumble. The figure's scream echoed one last time before it vanished into the collapsing ruins of the cave, its power completely broken. For a moment, Sarah stood there, disoriented and breathless, as the echoes of the explosion faded into silence. Her entire body ached, and she could feel the weight of exhaustion threatening to overtake her. But she couldn't stop now. She had to escape. She turned, her eyes searching for a way out. The cave was collapsing around her, the walls crumbling, the ceiling beginning to cave in. Dust and debris filled the air, and the ground beneath her feet quaked. There was no time to waste. Her eyes locked onto the entrance. The faint light of the outside world visible through the dark tunnel leading to freedom. She took a deep breath, the burning in her chest still lingering, but it didn't matter. She had survived the worst, and now she had to get out, to ensure that the darkness that had almost claimed her life would never rise again. With one last, determined push, Sarah ran. The ground shook beneath her feet, but she didn't slow down. She sprinted through the crumbling tunnel, dodging falling rocks and debris, her heart pounding in her chest. The roar of the cave's destruction was deafening, but she didn't stop. She could see the light growing brighter, the entrance just within reach. She leaped toward it, her body propelled by sheer adrenaline. As she burst through the opening, she stumbled into the outside world, gasping for air. The sun, now setting on the horizon, bathed the forest in a soft golden light. It was over. The cave, the dark power, had been sealed away once more. But as Sarah stood there, breathing in the cool evening air, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. The forest around her seemed different now, alive with an energy she couldn't explain. And even though the figure was gone, a part of her knew. There would always be remnants of that ancient power, buried deep in the heart of the earth. As she walked away, the sound of the gorilla's distant roar echoed behind her. She wasn't sure if it was a warning or a cry of victory, but one thing was clear. Sarah had escaped the darkness, and for now, she was free. But she knew that her connection to the forest was far from over. She had been part of its story from the beginning, and it was a story that was still unfolding. The question remained, how long would it be before the darkness would rise again? Sarah's legs were trembling as she stumbled through the dense forest, her breath ragged from the frantic escape. The distant rumblings of the cave's collapse were now nothing more than a faint memory, but the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on her heart. She had narrowly escaped the darkness that had almost consumed her, and yet, the deeper she ventured into the forest, the more unsettling her surroundings became. The trees, once serene and peaceful, now seemed to whisper in the wind, their branches creaking with a new, sinister energy. Sarah's mind spun, overwhelmed by the memories of the cave, the ancient figure, and the gorilla that had led her there. The image of the creature's desperate eyes, the bond they had shared, haunted her. She had done it. She had destroyed the source of the evil, sealed the darkness away. But in the process, she had felt something shift deep within herself, something that wasn't entirely hers. It was as though she had unlocked a power that wasn't meant for her to wield, and even though she had survived, there was a lingering sense that the forest had claimed a part of her soul. With each step, her chest tightened. There was an aching emptiness in her heart that she couldn't shake. The gorilla, her protector, her ally, was gone. And despite everything, despite how terrifying it had been, Sarah found herself mourning its loss. The creature had been her only companion, the only one who had understood her, the only one who had been there for her when the world seemed to turn against her. And now, it was just a memory, a silent shadow in the distance. She stopped for a moment, wiping away the tears that had suddenly begun to fall. The forest, once so alive with strange energy, now seemed eerily quiet. Even the breeze had stopped, as though it were holding its breath in anticipation. Sarah's heart beat loudly in her ears as she stood there, alone in the wilderness, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But the silence didn't last long. There was a rustling in the bushes ahead of her, the faint snap of twigs beneath heavy footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. She had barely escaped from one nightmare. Was it happening again? Was she being hunted by whatever dark force she had unleashed? As the figure emerged from the underbrush, Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. It was the gorilla, but it wasn't the same as before. Its fur was matted and worn, and its body seemed broken, as though it had been dragged across the forest floor. Yet, despite its injuries, it was still moving, still searching for her. She took a shaky step forward, her voice trembling as she called out, "No, you're supposed to be gone. But before she could finish, the gorilla collapsed to the ground, its massive body crumpling in exhaustion. Sarah rushed to its side, her hands trembling as she knelt down beside it. The gorilla looked up at her, its eyes filled with the same unwavering intensity they had held in the cave. Despite the bruises and the blood, despite the pain, its gaze still carried a sense of determination. It let out a weak, almost pitiful growl, as though trying to speak, trying to convey something to her. Sarah's chest tightened with emotion. The gorilla, her protector, the creature that had kept her safe, had been the one to shield her from the darkness. She had thought it had perished in the cave, destroyed by the very power it had once guarded. But here it was, alive, though broken, yet still fighting. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she gently cradled its head in her hands. She didn't know how or why it had survived, but she knew one thing for sure. This creature wasn't just a beast. It was a part of her journey, a part of her heart. She owed everything to it. And yet, she couldn't shake the overwhelming guilt that tugged at her soul. She had awakened something far greater than she ever intended, and in doing so, she had dragged the gorilla into a battle it had never asked for. It had fought for her, even at the cost of its own life, and now it was here, broken and dying. "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered through the tears. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." The gorilla's eyes softened, and for a moment, it seemed to understand her words, its pain momentarily forgotten. It let out a low sigh, and then, with a final, labored breath, it reached out its hand and placed it gently on her shoulder, as if offering comfort. There was something about the gesture that made Sarah's heart shatter. The bond they shared, the bond she had never fully understood until now, had been far more than just survival. It had been love in its purest form. As she sat there, holding the gorilla in her arms, the weight of everything they had been through crashed down on her. She had been through hell. She had fought an ancient evil, destroyed the source of darkness, and freed the forest from its grip. But in doing so, she had lost something precious, something that had given her strength when she had nothing left. The gorilla's hand slowly slid from her shoulder, and its eyes began to close, its breathing slowing. She could feel its life slipping away, and though she wanted to scream, though she wanted to beg it to stay, she knew in her heart that it was time. The gorilla had fulfilled its purpose. It had protected the forest, protected her, and now it could rest. With a final soft exhale, the gorilla went still in her arms. For a long moment, Sarah sat there, her body trembling as she cradled the creature she had come to love. The wind began to stir again, the trees whispered softly, and the forest seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. But as Sarah looked down at the gorilla one last time, she realized something. It wasn't just the forest that had been freed. She had been freed too. Her journey wasn't over, The darkness had been vanquished, the bond had been forged, and now it was her turn to carry forward the legacy the gorilla had left behind. She wasn't alone anymore. The forest, the creatures, and the memories of the gorilla would always be with her, guiding her as she moved forward into a new chapter of her life. The forest whispered its final farewell as Sarah stood, wiping her eyes. She knew she would never forget the gorilla, the protector that had given everything for her survival. And though it was gone, its spirit would live on in the heart of the forest and in hers. With a quiet, determined step, she turned away from the place where the gorilla had fallen. The world ahead of her was uncertain, but Sarah knew one thing for sure: she would never stop fighting. For herself, for the memory of the gorilla, and for the legacy of the forest that had shaped her destiny. The wind whispered through the trees as she walked, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah smiled, a faint, bittersweet smile, knowing that she had found her true strength.